Welcome to Music History Monday for August 12th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is Giovanni Gabrieli and the Miracle That Is Venice. If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. We mark the death on August 12, 1612, 412 years ago today, of the composer Giovanni Gabrieli. Born in Venice circa 1555, he grew up and spent his professional life in that glorious city, and died there as a result of complications from a kidney stone. Gabrieli's magnificent, soul-stirring music went a long way towards helping to define the expressive exuberance of what we now identify as Baroque-era music. The impact and influence of his music was ginormous, an impact and influence that culminated a century later in the German High Baroque music of Johann Sebastian Bach. To a degree beyond any other composer before or after him, Gabrieli's music has come to be identified with his hometown of Venice, in particular the acoustically unique Venetian performance venues for which so much of his music was composed. It is necessary, then, for us to spend some time in Venice, if only to get some inkling of what makes this singularly remarkable city so spiritually, artistically, and architecturally unique, and why Gabrieli's music is uniquely Venetian. We can do anything better than you can. Leave it to the Venetians. Historically, they've been good at almost everything. As seafarers and merchants, they were trading with Russia, India, Siam, and China at a time when most of the rest of Europe believed those locations to be the stuff of legend and fantasy. As statesmen, the Venetians invented what we today consider modern diplomacy. The Venetians created a system of self-government that was, for all of its flaws and limitations, the most democratic of its time, one that survived, with a minimal amount of fine-tuning, for hundreds of years. As industrialists, they were using techniques of mass production 500 years before Henry Ford. Venetian painters, sculptors, and architects played a huge role in defining such styles as Byzantine, Gothic, and Baroque. And then there's Venetian music. Between roughly 1550 and 1750, no other European city could claim to be a greater patron of the musical arts than Venice. No other city offered shelter, inspiration, and encouragement to as many composers. No other city celebrated and rewarded musical innovation more than Venice. Not bad for a city whose population maxed out at around 170,000 permanent residents, circa 1575. La Serenissima, the Serene Republic, the Venetian Republic. From the moment those first 5th century Venetians chose to build their city in the shallow Laguna Veneto off the Italian mainland for their protection, Venice and the Venetians have been a city and a people apart. Historically, the Venetians have protected their independence the way a large carnivorous quadruped protects her young. Almost from the day of its founding, traditionally celebrated as being March 25th, 421 CE, the Venetian Republic withstood all attempts by Rome to subjugate her to its iron-fisted rule, and as a result, Venice developed a reputation, a well-earned reputation, as a haven of personal freedom. It was a monumentally irritated Pope Gregory XIII, born Ugo Boncompagni, 1502 to 1585, who bitterly complained during his papacy that, quote, "I am Pope everywhere, except in Venice," unquote. Even the least sympathetic among us should feel something of Gregory's pain. At the time Gregory so complained, around 1580, the Counter-Reformation was in full swing. The Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's official response to the catastrophe that was the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517 and had, virtually, torn Europe in half, Protestant North versus Roman Catholic South. Music, which played a huge role in Catholic worship, played an outside role in the edicts of the Counter-Reformation. Catholic counter-reformists demanded that noisy instruments be banned from church services, that church music be expressively toned down and be made less grand and more prayerful, and that the texture of such music be made simpler so that the words being sung were intelligible. These dictates were mandatory, and they were followed throughout Catholic Europe, except in Venice, a city in Rome's own backyard. No wonder the Pope despaired. "I am Pope everywhere, except in Venice." Writing in the early 1550s, the author, playwright, poet, satirist, blackmailer, and resident of Venice, Pietro Aletino, 1492 to 1556, proudly asserted of his adopted city, quote, "Here treason has no place. Here favor in high circles does no wrong to be set right. Here the insolent and effeminate give no commands. Here no one robs, coerces, or murders. O Venice, hostelry of the dispersed and exiled, how much greater would be Italy's woes if your bounty were any less! Here stands a refuge for all other nations. Venice opens her arms to all who others shun. She welcomes those whom others persecute. She lifts up all whom others abase. And so I bow to Venice with good reason. She is a living reproach to Rome," unquote. Okay, granted, Pietro Aletino exaggerates. Venice was, like all of her neighbors, a police state, and woe to anyone who betrayed her. But Signore Aretino makes a larger point, and it is a point well taken. In comparison with other Italian cities, Rome in particular, this most serene Republic of Venice, La Serenissima, was, according to the musicologist H.C. Robbins Landon, quote, "a paradise of personal freedom and tolerance," unquote. Venice remains one of the wonders of the world, a real-life late medieval/Renaissance theme park of unbelievable, jaw-dropping beauty. It took extraordinary resources, the very biggest bucks, or ducats as the case was, to create such a city in the middle of a lagoon. Venice's entrepreneurialism, commercial success, and subsequent wealth were the stuff of legend and envy almost from the time of its founding. Venetian traders used Venice's access to the sea and overland routes to trade, making it, by the 13th century, the most prosperous city in Europe. By the 15th century, at the very height of its power, the Republic of Venice dominated commerce in the Mediterranean, fielding over 3,300 ships manned by over 36,000 sailors. The wealth generated by Venetian trade was tremendous, and Venice's financial elite competed with each other to build the most magnificent palazzi, that would be palaces, and to become patrons of the most gifted artists. Venice's government was structured along the lines of the ancient Roman Republic. It was governed by a Grand Council made up of representatives from the city's richest families. Grand and powerful the council was. It appointed all public officials and elected one of its own to be the Doge, or Duke, the formal head of the city. The Grand Council also elected a Senate of anywhere from 200 to 300 members, from which was chosen the Council of 10, a group charged with the actual governance of the city. Venice's wealth, beauty, and its physical separateness from the Italian mainland bred tremendous civic pride and a ferocious sense of independence. No one was going to tell the Republic of Venice how to conduct its affairs, and that included the Roman Church. And while the great bulk of Venice's population was Roman Catholic, the Grand Council was made up of businessmen who chose to conduct their business their own way, quite apart from papal dictates. Like the city itself, the Venetian religious establishment considered itself independent and was, in reality, more closely allied to the Venetian government and the reigning Doge than to the Roman Church, which was something, as we have observed, that drove the authorities in Rome a bit crazy. For example, during the Counter-Reformation, the Republic of Venice failed to execute even a single heretic. Can you believe it? It wasn't just Venice's independent attitude and lack of religious zeal that upset the Roman authorities. They were also scandalized by Venice's well-earned reputation as a wide-open city of pleasure, the Las Vegas, the Bangkok of its time. Thanks to the city's beauty and the Venetians' love of art, music, architectural splendor, pomp, prostitutes, and a good party, the latter including Carnival, Saints' Days celebrations, and the regatta, the gondolier races, Venice became Europe's #1 tourist attraction. I am Pope everywhere except in Venice. Thus spoke Pope Gregory XIII, and he was correct. And at no time was the Venetian predisposition to do things in their own way more pronounced than when it came to the music they cultivated during the Counter-Reformation. According to the English historian and travel writer John Julius Norwich, quote, "When it came to music, Venice showed all her old, stubborn individuality. There was no logical reason why Venice's Basilica of San Marco should follow a different liturgy, requiring different music from that of any other great church or cathedral in Christendom. But it did, and, as happened again and again in Venetian history, the Pope was obliged to accept the inevitable and give it his blessing." Unquote. The Basilica of San Marco, or Saint Mark, and music in Venice. At a time when Roman Catholic establishments were required to follow the Counter-Reformation's dictates regarding music, the church establishment in Venice simply did not. Aside from the Venetians' proclivity to do what they pleased, a major contributing factor to the nature of Venetian religious music is the design of the Basilica of San Marco itself, which was and remains the heart and lungs of Venetian musical life. Parenthetically, I would tell you that San Marco is not a cathedral, meaning the central church in a diocese that serves as a bishop's seat. Rather, it is the private chapel of the Venetian government. Its liturgical cachet was based on its ownership of what were presumably holy relics of Saint Mark himself. San Marco is like no other building in Western Europe. Constructed on the outline of a Greek cross and completed circa 1094, it features 5 domes, a large central dome surrounded by 4 slightly smaller domes. All 5 domes are lined with glass and stone mosaics. The 19th century French poet, dramatist, and literary critic Théophile Gautier, 1811 to 1872, described the interior of San Marco as, quote, a golden cavern encrusted with precious stones, splendidly somber and yet brilliant with mystery, unquote. By the late 15th century, 2 widely spaced organ lofts had been as well installed in the basilica. Between its cavernous size, multiple domes, the hard surfaces provided by the mosaics, and the pavimento, the peculiarly Venetian stone floor, and its choir lofts, San Marco had acoustical properties unique on the planet. Properly positioned, individual instruments could be heard with stunning clarity across great distances. Instrumental groupings that would otherwise be unthinkable, like a single string player situated within a large brass ensemble, can be made to sound perfectly balanced in San Marco. Okay, here's a no-brainer rhetorical question. Is there a composer anywhere who, given the opportunity, could resist experimenting with San Marco's unique acoustics? Answer: we don't think so. And certainly, given the Venetians' taste for the spectacular and magnificent, for extravagant pageantry and sumptuous celebrations, such experimentation was not going to be discouraged. So while nothing in this world is inevitable except death, taxes, and the endless foolishness of our species, it was almost inevitable that at some point a unique sort of music would emerge from Venice's Basilica of San Marco, a music that reflected the spirit of the city as well as the spatial and acoustic characteristics of the basilica itself. That is precisely what happened during the second half of the 16th century, and as a result, 4 important elements were added to the active language of Western music. 1. The expressive extravagance of this music, itself a reflection of the spirit of the Venetian Republic, became a pan-European aesthetic element in the music of the 17th and early 18th centuries. 2. The alternating, sometimes dueling choirs of voices and instruments characteristic of music at San Marco came to be known as constituting the concertato style, a compositional style that helped to lay the groundwork for the invention of the genre concerto during the late 17th century. 3. The use of musical instruments at San Marco, particularly in the works of Giovanni Gabrieli, went far beyond the accompanimental role they had played up to that time when combined with voices. Instruments at San Marco did not just double or embellish the vocal parts, but alternated with them, and at other times took the thematic lead themselves, thus helping to establish the beginnings of a purely instrumental compositional tradition. 4. Late 15th and early 16th century Venetian religious music was as much a celebration of the majesty of the Venetian Republic as it was a celebration of things religious. Such musical magnificence in the service of the state became increasingly prevalent across Europe during the 17th century. By the 1570s, composers were actively exploiting San Marco's unique acoustics by placing two separate choirs of voices and/or instruments in the two separate organ lofts. This performance technique of alternating two or more separate choirs is called antiphony. Such antiphonal performances took place at San Marco primarily during Vespers, during evening prayers, because it was during Vespers that psalms were sung, and by biblical tradition, psalms were to be sung antiphonally. It was the Franco-Flemish born Adrian Willaert, circa 1490 to 1562, who was master of music, maestro di capella, at San Marco from 1527 to 1562, who standardized the techniques for using split choirs at the basilica, thus paving the way for the spectacular compositions produced there by the end of the century. Giovanni Gabrieli, circa 1555 to 1612. By the last years of the 16th century, the multi-choral or polychoral music being composed for performance at San Marco had virtually nothing to do with the spirit and dictates of the Counter-Reformation, and everything to do with the exuberant, independent spirit of Venice. The great exponents of this polychoral Venetian music were the Gabrieli boys, Andrea Gabrieli, circa 1510 to 1586, and his nephew, Giovanni Gabrieli. When we return in tomorrow's Dr. Bob Prescribes, it will be with the life and music of the spectacularly influential Giovanni Gabrieli. Until then, to sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses / The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.